Okay, so one more video. Hopefully I'll speak fast. I'm almost positive I can make it through and give you a nice conclusion here, hopefully. Here, though, what I was doing before we got cut off again is giving you a really kind of overview of how to connect the secondary supplemental text, the More Than Skin Deep chapter, to Isabel and Curzon. And then what I wanted to do next, if I could, is get even more specific. And I want to give you a really particular, specific example of how you might answer the first question in the discussion thread. And that, of course, will be up by the 14th for you guys. So the epigraph I'm interested in, and I'm going to turn to my text here. I love the language of this particular chapter. This is from chapter 30, as it says here, of Chains. The epigraph is Monday, September 16th through Saturday, September 21st, 1776. Oh, the houses in New York, if you could but see the insides of them, occupied by the dirtiest people on the continent. If the owners ever get possession again, I am sure there will be years in cleaning them. And this comes from a particular letter from the Morning Chronicle and London Advertiser newspaper. So again, this epigraph frames for us the content or a theme of the coming chapter. And so the next question has to be, what happens in the chapter, and of course then, so what? And our so what, if we're thinking about the question in the thread, is connected to characterization. So we know what epigraphs do. We know that Anderson is writing a piece of historical fiction in Chains. Those are givens, right? But how might an epigraph be connected to characterization or to understanding character? So what happens in the chapter? A really quick rundown here. Isabel's plan, if you recall, to run away and offer her services to the British Army is foiled when Lockton arrives in port and sees her. So this is right after the victory. The rebels have been driven from the city. She's actually beginning to offer her services to a Brit. He says, we cannot accept any services from you because you belong to a loyalist. And then Lockton arrives, sees her. She returns to her master's home to find all other servants have fled. So Becky's gone, other servants have gone. And that means that she has to work nonstop at the Locktons, and her physical exhaustion matches her mental exhaustion because her plan of escape has been foiled. She's sort of walking in a haze, almost numb. She is then sent in this chapter to the kind Lady Seymour's home to toil, though the work is more bearable than at the Locktons, not because of its degree and kind, but because of the kindness of the old woman and their better conditions. She can sleep in an attic. It's hot, but it doesn't leak. There's not worms when it rains. The details let us know. So those are the plot line occurrences. What I've asked you guys to do in that question is to take the epigraph, or one or two epigraphs, and talk about how they function to build characterization. So that epigraph really focuses on the disaster that is left in the homes of loyalists, right? The mess left behind by those now occupying their homes. I'm interested in that because there's a kind of central irony, right? The home, the Locktons' home is full of those celebrating the victory of driving away rebels from the city. So you've got this full house, full of industry, busyness, celebration, and Isabel, of course, is absolutely destitute, and not only body, but mind. Later, when she goes to Lady Seymour's, that house is also full, remember, of the Hushions. And it also is, again, full of people, full of business, full of work to be done, hard labor, but she, of course, is empty. And so I'm really interested in some of the phrasing when I consider what is the state of Isabel's character at this point in time, which is the core of what I've asked you to do in that first question. So, since repetition is indication of importance in any given text, the line "it mattered not," uttered 3 times in the first 2 pages of the chapter, interests me, especially since it is accompanied by a description of exhaustion or of Isabel's bones as hollow and her brain pan empty. So this chapter begins on let me get back here, on 185. And within these first 2 chapters, or 2 pages of this chapter, you've got this reference to "it mattered not." So let's see. You've got, this is right after she gets home. Becky had vanished, her rooms at the Oliver Street boarding house abandoned. I was the only servant in the house. It mattered not. My bones were hollow sticks, my brain pan empty. Later on in the same couple of paragraphs, Madam ordered the silver polished and the table linens ironed in honor of her guests. The bird was so dry it near splintered the tongues of the officers, this chicken she's cooked. Madam let loose on me in the kitchen after the gentleman had taken Master Lockton to Ashley's tavern for a night of beer drinking and pipe smoking. It mattered not. A little further down, when I finally lay down to sleep, I set Ruth's doll beside my head. I had stopped kissing it good night. I did not say prayers. My bones were hollow and my brain pan empty. And then right at the bottom of page 186, I threw them down the privy and baked cornbread, so the biscuits, deep in the night, for that was the only thing my hands knew how to bake. The cornbread burned to charcoal when I fell asleep, head on the table. It mattered not. So it was really interesting repetition of things not mattering. So whether she gets, shouted at, or Mrs. Lockton, Madam Lockton threatens her, it doesn't matter. So there's this kind of hollowness that sets in. So I say here that I find it ironic that as her physical activity increases to meet the demands of the celebrating British loyalists at the Lockton residence, her mental acuity decreases, right? She's not as sharp. She doesn't have a plan, right? Her plan has been foiled. She no longer is thinking about how she can get away to get to her little sister. At the end of the chapter, as she lay alone in the attic of Lady Seymour's occupied house, so another kind of full house, a defining moment of her character's journey occurs. Isabel fears she has lost her faith. So this is the last portion of the chapter. Anderson writes, Ruth's doll lay next to my head, her eyes staring up at the ceiling. I knew I ought to pray for Ruth, or for Mama, or for anything. I ought just pray, but, the words would not come. I feared the spirit had left me. Here, then, and throughout the chapter, Isabel's become Ruth's cornhusk doll, hasn't she? She's hollowed, staring, and mute, despite this rush of activity around her and the hard labor that she has to do alone. So for me, the epigraph that lays out the incredible hard work that someone like Isabel left alone, being a 13-year-old girl, someone has to accomplish in absence of other slaves who have fled, or servants who have now fled. There's a kind of irony to that all of that dirt, all of that activity, all of the work that she must do keeps her hands busy, but she is but a husk at this point in time, right? She's someone absolutely emptied out. Thus far, she has kept her faith. Thus far, she's been able to continue developing plans for escape, plans to maintain the freedom that she was granted, right? Or to rather reclaim it and then maintain it. But here she loses hope. Here she is beaten down by work, so physical labor, but also there's a kind of mental dullness that sets in, a kind of loss of the spirit. Of course, the last line of this chapter is, when I woke, the city of New York was consumed with burning hellfire. And so chapter 31 onward for a few chapters actually details out the Great Fire of New York, one of the great fires of New York City, this one in 1776. And of course, in that fire, she loses Ruth's doll, and she says she's lost everything. But I think it's interesting if we consider that here she's become the doll, lifeless as the doll, this dried husk, this hollowed doll lying next to her, staring at the ceiling. It's a good thing that she loses the doll, right? It's a good thing that she somehow moves beyond being this husk and loses that sense of dullness, especially as she's helping Lady Seymour escape her home and gains hope yet again. But here you've got this really interesting moment of irony. The epigraph, of course, laying out the great industry and labor that the inhabitants of New York would have to go through to get their homes clean. And then, of course, the labor that is placed on her as she is an inhabitant who's remained behind. But as far as characterization, there's an irony existent because she has lost that active mind. She's lost that will to find a way out, at least for now. I hope this gives you a specific idea of ways to move from the very general, those 5 questions, to synthesizing the questions with a well-known story like Superman, to thinking about literary lenses and kind of changing the lenses and asking different questions of a text. And then, of course, opening a space for our study with these 2 texts, the first pair of texts that create these bookends. And at least for thread 1, so discussion thread 1, looking at a really specific example of how to go about answering that first question, which is, in its very nature, literary, asking you to look at the structure of Anderson's texts, the epigraph structure, in such a way that you see epigraphs as not just introducing themes or concepts or reinforcing the idea that the text is one of historical fiction, since Anderson pulls from historical documents, but also how is it that these epigraphs function to build characterization. You, of course, can choose to do Curzon if you'd like to. I'm really moved by this chapter because I feel like it's a low point for Isabel, who's such a fiery character, but it's also a point that she, of course, ascends from as we continue to watch her, not just throughout the rest of this text, but also as we encounter her yet again in Forge. So hopefully this gives you a sense of what the teacher is looking for, and of course sets up a framework for your study as you're thinking about what lens you'd like to try on for your interpretations, your interpretive adventures during the semester. Thank you for listening, guys. Let me know if you have questions by emailing via the CourseDen email tool, or of course asking in the discussion thread when it opens in a couple of days. Have a great time. Bye-bye.